Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. Today, we are going to present a webinar on the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. This is being presented to the New England states by EPA and Army Corps. So thank you so much for joining today. NUIPIC is hosting the webinar, and my name is Audra Martin. All right, so just a quick note on NUIPIC, since we are your hosts today. NUIPIC is a regional commission that helps the states of the Northeast preserve and advance water quality. We engage and convene water quality professionals and other interested parties from New England and New York to collaborate on water, wastewater, and environmental science challenges across shared regions, ecosystems, and areas of expertise. So hopefully you're not hearing about NUIPIC for the first time today, but if you are, go to our website and learn more about us. So I would like to now welcome and introduce the folks that you'll be hearing from today. From EPA, we have Jackie LeClaire. She's the Chief of the Wetlands Protection Section at EPA Region 1 and has managed the Wetlands Program for the past 7 years. She's worked for EPA for 22 years in a variety of water programs. Also from EPA is Erica Sachs-Lambert, who is the Wetland Ecologist in Region 1. Erica has worked at the EPA in the Wetlands Program for the last 12 years. She serves as the region's science and technical lead for wetlands and other aquatic resource matters and as the regulatory lead for the Rhode Island Program. And from U.S. Army Corps New England District, we have Tammy Turley, who's the Chief of the Regulatory Division at Army Corps New England District, where she has served since July 2019. She administers the regulatory program through the 6 New England states. And she previously served as the Regulatory Division Chief in the Nashville District and spent the first 10 years of her Corps of Engineer career in the Huntington District. Also joining us is Paul Mencken, who is the Wetland Ecologist with the Regulatory Division of the New England District. Paul is involved in performing and reviewing wetland delineations, developing functional assessment methods, analyzing functions and services of wetlands, and wetland mitigation review and monitoring. He is a professional wetland scientist and a certified senior ecologist and holds a doctorate in botany. Happy to have all of these guys here to help guide us through this new rule. And first, we will hear from Jackie and Tammy to give us a little bit of introduction, and then later Erica and Paul will kind of get into the bulk of the presentation. So I will now invite Jackie and Tammy to unmute your lines and turn it over to you.
Oh, hi everyone, this is Jackie. So there are some significant jurisdictional changes that are coming out of this, this new rule that went into effect in June. So we wanted to engage with you today to explain the changes and hopefully answer any questions that you have. And we also feel that this is probably the first of many engagements that we're going to be having in the upcoming months about the rule and some of the tools that you'll be hearing about afterwards. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Tammy.
Thanks, Jackie. This is Tammy with the Corps, and so nice to meet everyone virtually if I haven't met you in person. As Audra mentioned, I've been with the New England District about a year, so I'm almost acclimated to your wonderful region. Thanks so much for participating in today's engagement. We realize we work very closely with our state partners in implementing our respective permitting programs. We absolutely don't see a change in that and want to continue to nurture those relationships and make sure we're being as informative and transparent as we possibly can in jointly implementing this rule with EPA. So we're looking for your feedback today and recommendations on any future engagements that would be recommended as a group, or if we need to take a deeper dive in some of the more complex issues. We're happy to do that, and we're happy to schedule something in the future. And then ultimately, we want to plan with you an outreach event to the public, because ultimately they need to understand changes in our program and any changes to the state program that would be reflected, or to ensure they understand that there is no change in the state program. So again, looking for feedback, looking forward to the next 2 hours with you and understanding your perspectives and questions. So thanks for that, and I'll turn it back to you, Audra.
Thank you. Well, I'm actually just going to pass this over to Erica Lambert at EPA.
All right, so we're gonna talk today about the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So, all right, so we're gonna just start right off the bat with what are we even talking about here? So, navigable waters is sort of the key term around which the Clean Water Act is built. So the Clean Water Act, the language in the Clean Water Act says the term discharge of a pollutant means the addition of any pollutant to navigable waters from any point source, and that's what the Clean Water Act is designed to regulate. And then it goes on in the statute to define navigable waters as waters of the United States, including the territorial seas. And so the Clean Water Act is telling us that we have authority over navigable waters, which means waters of the US, but then it doesn't go on to define waters of the US. And so the definition of waters of the US is ultimately what determines the extent of federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. That's what we're going to be discussing today. Basically, just to give you a little background on what is this navigable waters protection rule that we're discussing. So pre-Rapanos, pre all of the current shenanigans, we had been regulating using regulation that was written in 1986. And then when Rapanos came along, we added the Rapanos guidance, and that was how we determined jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. And then there was a sort of request that the agencies do a rulemaking. This, as part of the Rapanos decision, there was a request that the agencies actually engage in a rulemaking, which finally came about in 2015. A rule was published, some of you may remember, called the Clean Water Rule, which went into effect in August of 2015 and then was immediately put under a nationwide stay in October of 2015. So we had what I call the previous regulations, and then we had the 2015 Clean Water Rule. And then under this administration, there was an executive order to engage in another rulemaking. Let me see if I can show this screen. And so that was the beginning of where we are now. And that was initiated as a two-step process. Step one being to repeal the 2015 rule, step two being to revise and write a new rule. And so I'm not going to read all of this. This is sort of my how I keep track of what happened. But ultimately, the Clean Water Rule went through a variety of court cases. It went into effect, out of effect. We went back to the 1986 regulations, back to the Clean Water Rule, and in the meantime, the agencies were working on this current rule, which was at that time known as Step 1, WOTUS Step 1, WOTUS Step 2. WOTUS Step 2 being, WOTUS Step 1 being the repeal of the Clean Water Rule, WOTUS Step 2 being writing a new rule. And so in January 23rd, 2020, Step 2 rule was signed and renamed the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And that rule went into effect on June 22nd. And the reason I'm showing these slides is because I just want to make sure everybody understands that the Step 2 rule is the same as the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The other thing that the agency started doing, which I found very confusing, is referring to the Step 1 rule as the 2019 rule and using that term to refer to the 1986 regulations. Okay, everyone lost yet? Great. So I'm going to get back to our PowerPoint. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody's clear. The Navigable Waters Protection Rule, or NUPR, is the same as WOTUS Step 2. And when I refer to previous regulation, I'm referring to the 1986 rules, or what the agencies like to call the 2019 rule, which was WOTUS Step 1. All right, everybody write that down. So the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is written in 3 parts. The paragraph A lists the waters which are jurisdictional, which there's 4 categories. Paragraph B lists the non-jurisdictional waters. There's 12 of those. And then paragraph C has all the definitions. So under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, there's 4 categories of jurisdictional waters. We're going to look at these in more detail. This is just sort of a quick blink at what they are, and then 12 categories of non-jurisdictional waters, and we'll also look at those. And the key changes from how we were doing business previous to the NUPR are, so I think the most important points are that the second bullet, interstate waters, are no longer categorically jurisdictional. They're only jurisdictional if they meet one of the other definitions of jurisdiction. There's no more case-by-case significant nexus determinations of jurisdiction. For tributaries to be jurisdictional, they must be perennial or intermittent. All ephemeral streams are non-jurisdictional. These terms are defined in the rule. We'll look at those. The third category of jurisdictional waters in this rule are lakes, ponds, and impoundments. And in order for those to be considered jurisdictional, they must contribute surface water to a downstream traditional navigable water in a typical year. You're going to hear this term a lot, and we'll talk about that more, typical year. And then for wetlands to be jurisdictional, they must be directly abutting a category 1, 2, or 3 jurisdictional water. And we'll also talk about that very important change to the definition of adjacent wetlands. Then there's also some terms that are being defined for the first time in this rule, although they were widely in use, but now they're being codified. So perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral are defined in the rule. This term typical year, and then a couple of the exclusions, which have always been part of regulation or have been part of our regulations for a long time, but weren't specifically defined: prior converted cropland, waste treatment system, among other definitions. All right, so Paul, I'm going to give you mouse control and let's see what happens.
Okay, thank you. The A1 waters, the first type of the territorial seas and traditional navigable waters. These are basically the same things we've had before. Territorial seas, areas subject to ebb and flow of the tide, waters that are currently used or were used in the past or may be used in the future for foreign or interstate commerce. So there's not really a change in those types of waters. The main change is it combines the categories of traditional navigable waters and territorial seas. No real changes to the definition of traditionally navigable waters. These are areas that pretty much have been recognized as jurisdictional for a long, long time. Okay, so the A2 waters we'll talk about next, and these are tributary waters. This is sort of the, no pun intended, but kind of the skeleton of what's looked at in the jurisdictional areas. We'll talk about wetlands, and we'll talk about lakes, ponds, impoundments, and all, but it's all part of the tributary system that everything is supposed to be linked to, that it's linked to the tributary system, which eventually goes out to those A1 waters. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. What constitutes a tributary? A river, stream, or similar naturally occurring surface water channel that contributes surface water flow to an A1 water in a typical year, either directly or through one or more of the A2, A3, and A4 waters. So basically, we're talking about a naturally occurring surface water channel. I'll talk in a little bit about some areas that have been manipulated by humans, but it's still originated as a natural channel. So think of that as, again, it's important. Natural channel is an important feature of the tributary. Contributes surface water flow. So the water has to go from that channel eventually downstream to an A1 water, and it can be through any number of A2, A3, A4 waters. There's no limit to those numbers as long as they're a complete hydrologic connection through it. The connection has to contribute that flow in a typical year. So in other words, and we'll talk toward the end about what constitutes typical year and how to calculate that, but the idea is that it's not just something that only occurs in very wet years. If it's a dry year and you don't see that connection, it doesn't mean it's not normally there or typically there. So that's sort of what we're looking at with that typical flow or typical year flow. The tributaries have to be perennial or intermittent. Ephemeral tributaries are not jurisdictional in any way. We will talk about, in some ways, they can be non-jurisdictional conveyances, but they themselves are not jurisdictional. So it has to be either a perennial term, defined as surface water flowing continuously year-round, or an intermittent stream. An intermittent is surface water flowing continuously during certain times of the year, and more than in direct response to precipitation. So in other words, these are areas that during the wet season, the early part of the year, when we've had snow melt, rainfall, but we're really not getting a lot of evapotranspiration. So there's naturally high groundwater table. Those types of systems, we're getting base flow from the groundwater table. Also, snowpack is included. When they talk about the precipitation for ephemeral streams, they're really talking about very specific individual events. Like yesterday, a lot of parts of New England got hammered by heavy rain for a short term, but heavy rain. So a lot of streams that may have already dried up, it being fairly dry this summer and it's been hot, were flowing yesterday. But if they only flow in a typical year due to that type of rainfall, that would not constitute a typical jurisdictional flow. That would be an ephemeral system. It would not be flow beyond that. Snowpack, I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, or I'll talk about right now. The term snowpack is defined as layers of snow that accumulate over extended periods of time in certain areas. For instance, high elevation mountains, and of course for us, just northern parts, even southern parts of New England in some winters, you'll have snow all winter long. Typically, we're talking about snowfall or snow you can measure. You can see the layers from the different storms. There may be a January thaw. There may be some melting, but the entire pack does not go away and return with an individual snow. So this is something that's sort of a long-term, an entire seasonal hydrology source. So that's sort of what we're looking at with extended periods. There's no real need under this rule. If you remember some of the Rapanos rule, we treated perennial and intermittent streams a little bit differently. This rule does not treat them differently. For the most part, whether it's perennial or intermittent, it can be jurisdictional, assuming it meets all other conditions. Ephemeral and the ephemeral intermittent break is the one that's the most important for determining jurisdiction. Ephemeral being non-jurisdictional, intermittent being jurisdictional, again, if it meets all the other requirements. So the term ephemeral means surface water flow or pooling only in direct response to precipitation, rain, or snowfall. It's an immediate precipitation event, like I mentioned the storm yesterday. If it's an individual snowfall that melts completely away and doesn't become part of a snowpack, that's really in response to an individual precipitation event. It can be several events over a short period. For instance, you might get three days of rain, 3 out of 4 days of rain, and that's still a relatively short-term event. If the flow in the stream is only due to that time period, that would still be considered ephemeral if you're not getting it otherwise. So again, that's a direct response to the precipitation. Altered or relocated tributaries. Again, I mentioned that tributaries are natural water bodies. They start that way. In the case of the altered or relocated, what's happened is humans have come in for whatever reason. They may have channelized it, which is altering it, or actually even moved it for one reason or another. And that tributary is still jurisdictional as long as it continues to satisfy the flow conditions. In other words, is it intermittent or perennial, and does it continue to flow all the way out to the A1 waters via assorted connections? So that's what that's sort of looking at there. Non-jurisdictional connections. Remember, I mentioned that the tributary system has to connect ultimately all the way out to the A1 waters. So tributaries typically, small streams flow. The bigger streams, but a lot can happen in between that sort of affects things. So we can have connections that are non-jurisdictional. They themselves aren't intermittent or perennial flow, but they don't break the flow of the stream itself. So a tributary that does not lose its jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through the following features. For instance, a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature, an ephemeral stream, or a non-jurisdictional ditch. The non-jurisdictional ditch, ditches are not a specific category in this rule. Some ditches are jurisdictional and some ditches are not. So we can't simply call something a ditch and say it's one or the other. So we can have a non-jurisdictional ditch in this case, which would still form that connection. A channelized feature like that, subterranean river, go ahead, you can move on to the next now. This is just showing some of the channelized non-jurisdictional surface features. Essentially, this is the one on the right and probably the other one, although it looks dry. The one on the right, you can see the water. These are ditches that are, at the edge of the field. They're perhaps carrying surface flow, but it's something that's probably at best only a ephemeral flow. So it's not really a feature in itself that would be jurisdictional. However, if we have, say, a perennial stream upstream, flows through this, maybe some of it enters the groundwater, so the flow is not as strong here, so it's only ephemeral, and it flows out, continues downstream to where it becomes perennial again, simply because it has that ephemeral break. That ephemeral portion is non-jurisdictional, but the upstream perennial portion is still jurisdictional. Okay. Good. Subterranean rivers, I don't think that's super common here. We may have some. In karst topography, places like that, a lot of limestone, this is more common, where the river actually goes below ground, flows among the rocks and things like that. It stays pretty much in a channel. It's simply underground. Because it is underground, it is not jurisdictional under the NUPR. However, because it carries the discrete flow of that river, which eventually comes back out again, that river itself, both above and below the subterranean break, is still considered jurisdictional, as long as it's not different, collecting just all groundwater. It's got to be that surface flow going in still goes out the other end. Culverts, dams, tunnels, or similar artificial features, one of the most exciting, if you will, in the sense that people are kind of like scratching their heads and confused. Changes is that culverts are non-jurisdictional. You can have your stream flowing into the culvert, it's jurisdictional above, goes out the culvert, it's jurisdictional below. The culvert itself is non-jurisdictional. As long as it, however, provides a connection for an intermittent or perennial stream above, continue down to the A1 waters, it's providing that non-jurisdictional connection in that. Tunnels could do the same thing or some other artificial feature. Things like debris piles, boulder fields, or similar natural features, the same thing. Many of you, particularly further north, have been in boulder fields where you can actually hear the water running amongst the base of the boulders, but you're not really seeing a stream in that. In some cases, if you can find an ordinary watermark, you may have a stream section, but some of it is clearly not channelized. Well, it's flowing together in a channel, I guess. It's just subterranean again. It's below what we would consider surface. So as long as it's connected, what goes in comes out the other end. Those two other reaches are jurisdictional. The reach in the middle is not. There's some connections, however, that sever jurisdiction. Those are the ones we just talked about. Continued jurisdiction, they allow the jurisdiction to continue. Some, however, will sever it. Stream channel breaks that do not contribute surface water flow to downstream jurisdictional waters in a typical year. So in other words, if the only water getting down below that break only happens every few few hundred years or something like that. It's not happening in a typical year. So there may be an old channel and it may have been carved out by years of sporadic flow, but if it's not something that flows in a typical year, that would break jurisdiction because it does not have what's considered a continuous hydrologic connection down there. Surface stream channels that disappear underground and become part of the groundwater aquifer, same thing. Now, where we had that subterranean or tunnel-like rivers, those carried the main river water from above that feature through to below. However, in the case where really that water coming in just mingles out and spreads out into the groundwater, that's then considered sort of a loss. That it's not connected downstream. Therefore, that upper portion of it, even if it's a perennial stream, would be non-jurisdictional. Ditches, are they tributaries? In some cases they are. The term tributary includes a ditch that either relocates a tributary, is constructed in a tributary, or is constructed in an adjacent wetland. A ditch is defined, well, there's a definition of a ditch. Basically, it's a constructed or excavated channel. It's something that's human-made versus that. I already mentioned it's really not a standalone term of waters by itself. It can be jurisdictional or not jurisdictional. And when is it? Ditches are jurisdictional when they're A1 waters. If you've got a tidal ditch, it's a considered traditional navigable water, and A1 water, it would be jurisdictional. A2 waters, they're either constructed in or relocated a tributary or constructed in an adjacent wetland and satisfy the flow conditions of the tributary definition. Again, that is, they have to be intermittent or perennial flow for that. The wetland also has to be a jurisdictional wetland. If it's flowing through a non-jurisdictional wetland, that ditch does not become jurisdictional in there. Okay, the A1 water, showing more detail, territorial sea. Here you can see where canals probably have been dug so that everybody gets their own waterfront property in that back dune area there. Those are all subject to the ebb and flow of the tide in this particular example. So those waters would all be considered jurisdictional. They're A1 waters, and yet, even though they're human constructed. And A2 water meets the conditions if it meets the flow regimes. In other words, if it's perennial or intermittent under surface flow in a typical year, and it contributes surface water flow to jurisdictional water in a typical year. In other words, it's perennial, intermittent, and it's connected all the way down, so it contributes flow to that system further down. And its relocated tributary was constructed in the tributary, or it was constructed in adjacent wetlands. So it was constructed in something that was jurisdictional to begin with. When it comes to wetlands, the A4 waters are wetlands. So if it's constructed in an adjacent wetland, it's jurisdictional if it meets the definition of both wetlands and the adjacent wetlands. Only the portions of the ditch that meet the definition of adjacent wetland are jurisdictional. There can be other portions of it that were the ditch that were constructed in non-wetlands. Those would not be considered jurisdictional areas. They may contribute less than perennial or intermittent flow to paragraph A1 water in a typical year. Downstream portions should also be jurisdictional as a tributary as long as it contributes flow to another downstream water of the U.S. in a typical year and meets the flow conditions of the tributary system. So that's it for the tributaries. Go ahead.
So tributaries are the A2 waters under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The third category of jurisdictional waters are the A3 waters, are lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. And so we're going to look at those questions now. I mean, those features now. And just as a note, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the sort of important language in this rule is all in the definition. So lakes and ponds and impoundments of jurisdictional waters are defined in paragraph C, which is the definition section, and it's that definition that tells you whether or not you're looking at a jurisdictional water. So lakes, ponds, and impoundments, A3 waters. The term lakes and ponds and impoundments means standing bodies of open water. So the tributaries, we're looking at flowing water. Here we're looking at standing bodies of open water. But again, that contributes surface water flow to an A1 water in a typical year. Those bodies of water can either be naturally formed or they could be man-made features, as long as they are not one of the excluded features that we're going to look at in a little bit. They could be modified during their existence, but as long as they still meet the flow conditions, then and the definition of A3 waters, then they're still considered jurisdictional. So we're looking at standing bodies of open water, and they are jurisdictional either as an A1 water, so any feature, any aquatic resource that meets the definition of an A1 water as a traditional navigable water or territorial sea is considered jurisdictional as an A1 water, even if it also meets another definition. So lakes, ponds, and impoundments that are not A1 waters would be jurisdictional as A3 waters if, and there are two ways they may be jurisdictional. One is if they contribute surface water flow to an A1 water, again, in a typical year, and that flow can travel through any number of other jurisdictional waters or certain non-jurisdictional features. Or even if they don't contribute surface water flow, but if the body of water is inundated by flooding from another jurisdictional A1, 2, or 3 water, that also would provide the hydrologic connection to be considered jurisdictional. So a lake that is flooded by a river is considered jurisdictional, even though that lake itself may not be contributing water downstream. And just a note that an impoundment has to be an impoundment of a jurisdictional water to meet the A3 criteria. So you would have to look at the water itself to determine would it be jurisdictional if it weren't impounded, and now it is impounded. I'm actually not sure about, does it have to be jurisdictional now or before it was impounded? Do you know that answer, Paul?
Sorry, unmuted. I think it has to be considered, I believe it has to be considered jurisdictional prior to impoundment for it to be considered jurisdictional post-impoundment.
Similar to the adjacent wetlands. Okay, so so it had to have been jurisdictional and now it's impounded, so it's an impoundment of a jurisdictional water. Okay, so lakes, ponds, and impoundments, again, they have to either contribute surface water flow, and that can be through other jurisdictional waters, but they also can contribute surface water flow through certain non-jurisdictional features. The definition lists channelized non-jurisdictional surface water features. We already looked at those with tributaries. It also could be contributing flow through a culvert, dike, spillway, or similar artificial feature, or again, through a debris pile, boulder field, or similar natural fields. So similar to tributaries, if the flow travels through one of those non-jurisdictional features, but still continues in a typical year to a downstream jurisdictional water, then that upstream lake, pond, or impoundment is still considered jurisdictional. So a lake that goes through a culvert and then to a tributary would be jurisdictional, even though the culvert itself, as Paul mentioned, is not jurisdictional, as long as that connection exists in a typical year. Again, we will look at what is a typical year later on in the presentation. Impounded wetlands, again, so an impounded wetland is jurisdictional as an impoundment of jurisdictional water. So as we previously mentioned, if it would have been a jurisdictional wetland, so if the wetland that is impounded meets the definition of an adjacent wetland, which we haven't discussed yet, but if it meets that definition, then it would be jurisdictional as an adjacent wetland. or if the impoundment meets the conditions for A3 waters. So if the impoundment itself meets any of the criteria for lakes, ponds, or impoundments, then that impoundment is jurisdictional as an A3 lake, pond, or impoundment. This is just a note that some waters may, it's sort of to point out, some waters may meet jurisdictional criteria, more than one jurisdictional criteria, and then there's sort of a question of how do you designate it jurisdictional. So if it's impounded and meets that definition of lakes, ponds, and impoundments, then you would call it jurisdictional as an A3 water. But if it meets the definition of an adjacent wetland, then it would be jurisdictional as an A4 water. I know it's very confusing and maybe not that important unless you work for the Corps. Okay, exclusions that sever jurisdiction of upstream water. So again, just like with tributaries, while you can have connections made through non-jurisdictional features that preserve jurisdiction, there also are some features that sever that jurisdiction. So for example, if your A3 water, the flow from the A3 water is not channelized, so if the feature that water is traveling through is not a channelized feature, such as stormwater runoff, then that is not considered an acceptable connection to preserve jurisdiction upstream. So if the only connection from your pond to a downstream tributary is through stormwater runoff, then that pond is not, it's not considered jurisdictional. Again, if the excluded feature, so if the feature, the non-jurisdictional feature, so say the culvert, doesn't actually convey surface water flow to ultimately to an A1 water, to a traditional navigable water. So say the flow from that culvert goes into the groundwater, then that is considered a disconnect that does not preserve jurisdiction. And again, the feature jurisdictional, sorry, the non-jurisdictional feature has to convey surface water flow to the downstream traditional navigable water in a typical year. So everything sort of hinges on this concept of in a typical year. So if it's a particularly wet year and you have a surface water connection, but that does not say that year is atypical according to this definition of typical year, then that would not be considered a satisfactory jurisdictional connection. This is complicated by the fact that things are getting wetter, so we'll talk about that. And then in addition to the non-jurisdictional connections, there are also certain lakes and ponds that are considered categorically excluded from jurisdiction. So artificial lakes and ponds, which were constructed or excavated in upland or non-jurisdictional waters, are considered non-jurisdictional under paragraph B8, unless they meet, never mind, I'm just going to skip that. So adjacent wetlands, so the fourth category of jurisdictional waters are adjacent wetlands. And so adjacent wetlands have always been jurisdictional, but the definition of adjacent has changed periodically. And so again, adjacent wetlands are defined in the definition section, paragraph C1, and I'm going to walk through the components of that definition rather than reading you this whole slide. So, so the first thing is, what are wetlands? The definition of wetlands has not changed. It's been the same definition for several iterations of regulation. And I think most people are somewhat familiar with this definition: areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances, which is similar to typical year, do support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. And as we were presenting this morning, I hadn't quite made this connection yet, but it occurred to me that this definition of wetlands is, it's rooted in ecology, And then it's translated into the procedure for delineating a wetland and looking at the factors of hydrology, hydrophytic vegetation, and hydric soils. But the definition itself basically states that due to the hydrology of the area, it creates these wetland conditions that allow for hydrophytic vegetation and result in hydric soils. Now, the rule added a definition for upland, which is, wetlands, if they're not wetlands, are they upland? Is sort of the question, right? But it's interesting to note that the definition for upland in this rule refers specifically to the delineation criteria and not necessarily to the ecology of the area. So the definition for upland says it's any area that under normal circumstances does not satisfy all three wetland factors. Hydrology, hydrophytic, hydric soils as identified in the definition of wetlands, although they're not actually identified in this definition. They're identified in the delineation manual, and does not lie below the ordinary high water mark or the high tide line of a jurisdictional water. So these are the definition of upland is looking at the regulatory boundaries of wetland, whereas the definition of wetland is describing the ecology and assuming the regulatory boundary should more or less match the ecology. So personally, I just thought that was interesting. So adjacent wetlands. Now this is the big change. So adjacent wetlands have always been jurisdictional, but the past definition of adjacent was bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. And I'll note that in the 2015 rule, the challenge was to define neighboring. So, how close is your closest neighbor, or how far away is a neighbor before they're not a neighbor? Under this definition, adjacent wetlands must be abutting. So they must actually be touching an A1 through 3 water. They cannot be touching an A4 water, which is another adjacent wetland, and still be jurisdictional. They must actually touch one of the A1 through 3 TNW, tributary, or lake, pond, or impoundment to be considered jurisdictional, so no more neighboring. Or if they are not abutting, they are not actually touching, but in a typical year, they are inundated by flooding. So a wetland in a floodplain that is regularly flooded, every season, even though that wetland is not directly abutting the tributary itself, because it is inundated by flooding from an A2 tributary, it is also considered adjacent. So those are the two options. But if it is not inundated by flooding, or if the flooding goes from the wetland into the tributary, that's also not sufficient for adjacency. It has to be coming from the A1 through 3 water to the wetland. Okay, like our tributaries and lake ponds and impoundments, A4 waters also do have a caveat for certain specific physical separations. So an adjacent wetland, which would be abutting, however, it is separated only by a natural berm, bank, dune, or similar feature, would still be considered jurisdictional. Or if it is separated only by an artificial dike, barrier, or similar artificial structure. However, for the artificial structures, there is a caveat. So if the only separation is an artificial structure, that wetland is still jurisdictional as adjacent if the artificial structure allows for a direct hydrologic surface connection between the wetlands and the A1 through 3 water, such as through a culvert, floodor, tide gate, pump, or similar artificial feature. So a natural berm does not need to have a culvert. If a wetland is separated from a tributary only by a natural berm, it is still considered adjacent. But if it is separated by an artificial dike, there has to be some passageway through that feature that continues the hydrologic connection in order for the adjacent wetland to be considered jurisdictional. And this note on the bottom notes that an adjacent wetland that is divided in two is still considered jurisdictional. The entire thing is considered jurisdictional as long as the structure that divides it allows for flow to be continued from one side to the other. So for example, if you have a road that goes through a wetland and splits it in half, if the road has culverts through it, then the entire wetland is adjacent, even if one side of the road doesn't touch, is not abutting the downstream water. Or if the road is built at grade, and so when it floods, water goes over the road, or if it's tidal, the tides travel over the road to the other side of the wetland, then the entire wetland would be considered adjacent, as long as it still has that direct hydrologic connection. But if there's a road that's on a berm and there is no connection through the road, no culvert of any kind, then the side of the wetland that is abutting the A1 to 3 water would be jurisdictional, but the other side would not be because it was severed by an artificial structure that does not have a direct hydrologic connection. Whew, it's hard to say. Okay, I'm gonna go through non-jurisdictional waters and then we'll pause for more questions. So non-jurisdictional waters. So this first slide, I want to talk about for a minute because I found this to be a point of confusion for a lot of folks. So the difference between an exclusion and an exemption. So in the NUPR, in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the paragraph B waters are the waters that are excluded from jurisdiction. So an exclusion eliminates certain waters from the definition of waters of the US, and those waters are not jurisdictional as WOTUS. Now, this is different from exemptions, okay? So the Clean Water Act also has exemptions, and exemptions are discharges that are exempt, meaning activities that do not require a permit. And so we often talk about the agricultural exemptions in the Clean Water Act are listed in section 404F. Those are statutory exemptions, and those describe activities that do not require a permit as long as they meet the conditions of those exemptions. And it does not, it makes no difference whether that activity is going to occur in a jurisdictional water or not. That activity does not require a permit. The exemptions in the Clean Water Act, those 404F exemptions, are statutory, so they're in the statute, and they are not affected by anything in this rule. The exclusions, however, have changed from previous regulation, and I think the sort of punchline here is that an exclusion is a resource which is not regulated, and the exemptions are activities which are not regulated. And this little sentence on the bottom, a permit is not needed to perform an exempt activity even when it is in a jurisdictional water. And I've found over the years that there's a lot of confusion about the difference between jurisdictional resources and regulated activities and what the overlap is. This rule that we're discussing only discusses jurisdictional resources. Changes nothing about whether an activity is regulated or not, just depending on where the activity occurs. So there's 12 exclusions listed in paragraph B, and a lot of them have been always agency practice, but not necessarily codified in regulation. And one key point is that any feature, any water which is listed in paragraph B as an excluded feature cannot be considered jurisdictional also. So, and there's one caveat to that, but so if you're looking at a feature, if it meets the one of the exclusions, it is not jurisdictional even if it also meets the definition of one of the jurisdictional waters. The only caveat for that is ditches. So sort of the order of assessment would be, does this feature meet any of the criteria for an excluded water? And if so, then it's not jurisdictional, even if it also would be a traditional navigable water, for example. But if it's specifically excluded, then it's excluded. Ditches work the other way. Ditches are the one difference. You have to consider, is a ditch, is that particular ditch considered a regulated tributary under A2, or potentially an adjacent wetland? And if it is not an A1, A2, or A4 water, then it may be an excluded ditch. So, but for everything else, the exclusions sort of take precedence. Okay, so another key feature is that many of the exclusions refer to a feature which has been constructed or excavated wholly in upland. And again, upland is defined in the rules. So there's a list, there are 5 of these exclusions that only apply if that feature was constructed and excavated wholly being important, in upland or non-jurisdictional waters. And then the other sort of general concept about exclusions, which we've already discussed, is that there's a number of exclusions that, while that feature itself is not considered jurisdictional, it is still sufficient to maintain a jurisdictional connection between upstream and downstream waters. Not all of the exclusions, some of them. So, for example, groundwater is an excluded water. Groundwater is not sufficient to maintain a connection. But again, the channelized non-jurisdictional surface water features, such as ephemeral streams, might be sufficient to maintain an upstream and downstream jurisdictional connection. I'm going to go through this pretty quick, but just a couple of key points. The very first one listed, B1, it basically says waters or water features that are not WOTUS. So if you have a resource and it doesn't meet any of the 4 categories of jurisdictional waters, then it is automatically not jurisdictional, even if it is not listed in paragraph B. That's just the cover our bases exclusion. Groundwater has never been considered jurisdictional, although in the past groundwater has been used to make the connection to a jurisdictional water, but the groundwater itself has never been jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. Ephemeral features, as we already know, are not, anything ephemeral is not considered jurisdictional, but they may serve as a connection between 2 jurisdictional waters. As opposed to diffuse stormwater runoff, directional sheet flow, also not jurisdictional, and those may not be used to make that connection because they are not channelized. Excluded water features. Okay, so ditches, we've sort of already talked about ditches. So as I mentioned, ditches, you have to look at whether they might be jurisdictional first. So a ditch that is not a traditional navigable water, it's not an A1, it's not an A2, and it's not an adjacent wetland, it's not an A4, then those ditches would be excluded non-jurisdictional features. But again, they could serve as the connection. Prior converted cropland. So, heavy sigh. So prior converted cropland has always been considered excluded from jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. It's important to sort of understand what is prior converted cropland before this rule, and then what has this rule done with prior converted cropland. So prior converted cropland is a USDA designation through the Department of Agriculture. They basically define it under Swamp Buster to say lands that were drained or otherwise manipulated for the purpose of, agricultural production prior to 1985 is considered not a wetland, not a jurisdictional water, because it's been altered so much from its original state. That was sort of the concept behind it. And this prior converted cropland is a designation under USDA. And then there always has been sort of a caveat of, if that land is abandoned and reverts to wetland, then it might return to its jurisdictional status. So the agencies have always recognized that prior converted cropland designation by the Secretary of Agriculture, and if that designation exists, then that land is not considered jurisdictional. In this rule, there was a decision made to actually define prior converted cropland within the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, to sort of codify its exclusion from jurisdiction. And so I'm going to go to my next slide, talk about what we did here. So there's a couple of key changes. The first key change, so let me go back one slide. I'm just going to point out, an area is no longer considered prior converted cropland if it's abandoned, and abandonment occurs when it has not been used to support agricultural purposes at least once in the immediately preceding 5 years. Okay, so abandonment means that it now reverts to potentially being jurisdictional. In previous regulation, or rather prior to this regulation, there was another way that prior converted cropland might revert to being jurisdictional, and that was with a change in use. But this regulation only discusses the abandonment principle and no longer considers change in use as criteria for prior converted cropland to lose its excluded status. So that's one sort of major change. The other major change is that there's a sort of large difference between the USDA definition of agricultural product and, or rather agricultural purposes, and the definition in this rule of agricultural purposes. So USDA states that agricultural purposes include land use that makes the production of an agricultural product, so refers specifically to agricultural product, possible, and then including but not limited to grazing and haying. This rule, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, in the definitions section does not define agricultural purposes, but the preamble has a discussion about activities which are considered agricultural purposes, and it's quite a long list that are in the preamble, including but not limited to idling land for conservation uses, such as habitat, pollinator, wildlife management, water storage, supply and flood management, irrigation, tailwater storage, crawfish farming, cranberry bogs, nutrient retention, idling land for soil recovery following natural disasters like hurricanes and drought, and then states including but not limited to. So this definition, this rule has significantly broadened the definition or the activities which are considered agricultural purposes for the designation of prior converted cropland, well beyond what USDA looks at, and this has created a situation where the agencies, the Army Corps and the EPA, will no longer be able to rely on USDA to make that designation of prior converted cropland, but there will be circumstances where lands may not meet prior converted cropland under the USDA definition, but would meet that under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule definition. And because USDA is under no obligation to support our regulatory programs, those determinations will need to be made by the Army Corps. In addition, the preamble also lists conservation practices and programs which are conducted for or in support of agricultural purposes are also appropriate to maintain the prior converted cropland exclusion. So if someone is following one of the USDA agricultural, conservation practices, that would be considered adequate to maintain the prior converted cropland exclusion. However, that decision will need to be made by the Army Corps, because USDA has made it very clear that they have no intention of making regulatory decisions for us or for you. Sorry, Paul. So this prior converted cropland is a potential extra workload. I'll leave it there for right now. So then there's just a few more excluded waters, artificially irrigated areas, artificial lakes and ponds. These are all essentially upland that has been artificially converted to an aquatic resource and would not be aquatic except for whatever the construction of that artificially irrigated area or lake and pond. Water-filled depressions constructed or excavated in upland, incidental to mining or construction activity, those are not considered jurisdictional as long as they were excavated in upland or non-jurisdictional waters. Stormwater control features are not considered jurisdictional stormwater control features which have been constructed or excavated in upland are considered non-jurisdictional. And then again, this is the groundwater recharge, wastewater recycling structures. Again, if they were constructed or excavated in upland or non-jurisdictional waters, those are considered non-jurisdictional. The final exclusion are waste treatment systems, which also have always been excluded in practice, but are now codified into the list of excluded features and defined in the definitions section. The definitions say the term waste treatment system includes all components, including lagoons and treatment ponds, which are part of the waste treatment system. So any part of the waste treatment system is considered non-jurisdictional, even if it looks like a jurisdictional water.
We're nearing the end here. Typical year is that important phrase we've been throwing around over and over again. Basically, it means when precipitation and other climatic variables are within the normal periodic range, as both seasonally and annually, for the geographic area of the applicable aquatic resource. So something nearby, we're not looking at necessarily entire New England. It could be just the watershed where your project is in, based on a rolling 30-year period. As Erica mentioned earlier, things getting wetter. So looking at the entire 30-year period may or may not reflect recent years. We go through wet and dry phases of number of years, multiple year droughts, multiple year wet phases. So the idea of 30 years is to try and catch that. A typical year is a key concept for establishing jurisdiction. It's a connection issue, and it's also a frequency issue, frequency being at least once a year for that. So it's very important to have that concept looked at based on surface water flow between a relatively permanent body of water, a perennial intermittent stream water channel, and a standing or open water body. Does it have that typical year connection? Is only happening in wet years. If that's the case, that would not be considered only occurring in a typical year and would separate some features and make them non-jurisdictional. Okay. Provides a predictable framework for appropriately interpret data when determining the jurisdictional status of certain water bodies. In other words, if we're in a super wet year, everything looks like it's connected. Super dry year, nothing looks like it's connected. So what would be the typical year to determine what those connections would be in those typical years. Applies to some of the requirements for the following categories of waters: A2 waters, the tributaries, A3 lakes and ponds and impoundments of jurisdictional waters and adjacent wetlands. A lot of those refer to how they are connected into the tributary system. Is that connection in a typical year? Do the flows reach at least intermittent flow in a typical year? May also be applied to determine if the water's feature is not jurisdictional. Typical year will generally be determined by, again, looking at the normal precipitation on the 3 30-day periods preceding the observation date. It isn't tied entirely. Well, I'll talk about that the last one here. For each period, a weighted condition value is assigned to determine. Basically, the more recent time period has a higher weight than the more distant time period. We're looking at, and you're looking at the 70th and 30th percentiles. So basically, I think they're looking at a standard deviation there. A determination of normal, wetter than normal, or drier than normal is made based on the condition value sum. That then goes into the interpretation of, would this be at least an intermittent stream in a typical year? So based on the data we see for assessing it, it's like, okay, if it's a dry year, I look at this. Well, it looks like it flows year-round in a dry year, so we can then surmise that it likely flows year-round in a wet year or in a typical year. Other accurate and reliable measurements can be used for normal precipitation as well. They have to be something that is, scientifically documented types of things. The Corps has developed a tool, the antecedent precipitation tool, to help determine whether a typical year, or whether it's a typical year or not. So we can look back at, for instance, aerial photography, something from 2006, plug in the data into this tool, and it can tell us, is that a normal year, a typical year, or drier than typical, wetter than typical, so that the resources we're using, in this case aerial photography, how meaningful or useful that is for making that determination.
All right, so I'll turn it over to Jackie and Tammy.
All right. Hi, everybody. I just want to talk about several of the Clean Water Act programs that are affected as a result of the new scope of waters in the NWAPR. So starting with the water quality standards, section 303, I did poll some folks in our water quality group, and they say that they don't feel, and this is not for certain, but it's not felt that it's going to have a large impact because most of the state and tribal water quality standards have been written generally enough so that they're not really impacted by the differing definitions that we've observed over the years with respect to Supreme Court interpretations, the Clean Water Rule, and now this one. And also, states may adopt standards under state law for waters that aren't waters of the United States. It's just important to remember that those standards wouldn't be in effect for Clean Water Act purposes. The next section is impaired waters list under 303D and TMDLs. So some states may not assess non-jurisdictional waters and may identify fewer waters as being impaired as a result, and therefore develop fewer TMDLs. But again, states may continue to apply their own state law-based programs to identify and restore impaired waters, although this would no longer be a requirement for waters that are not federally jurisdictional, a Clean Water Act requirement, that is. Under the oil spill prevention, preparedness, and response, section 311, waters that are no longer federally jurisdictional, the requirements of the Clean Water Act with respect to spill prevention and preparedness will no longer apply. And also the Oil Spill Trust Fund will no longer be used to reimburse costs incurred by states for any non-federally jurisdictional non-WOTUS waters. I know several of our states had submitted concerns and questions about the section 401, the water quality certification. And the short answer to how this is going to affect 401 cert is that there's going to be a reduction in jurisdictional waters under the final rule, which is going to reduce the number of federal permits and licenses that require a 401 certification. But that said, states still have the option of applying their own state law and state water quality standards to these waters. For section 402, which is NIPD's, you folks know that EPA writes the permits for New Hampshire and Mass because they're non-delegated states. And going forward, only waters jurisdictional under the new rule, federally jurisdictional waters will require a federal discharge permit. The NIPD's state program requirements allow authorized states, of which we have 4, to establish programs that are broader in scope and more stringent than the federal NIPD's programs. So states can therefore impose their own requirements for discharges into their waters that are no longer jurisdictional under the NWAPR, the NUPR, Navigable Waters Protection Act, sorry. Lastly, section 404, which is the dredge and fill permitting program, where Clean Water Act jurisdiction would no longer apply to waters under the revised definition. There'd be no section 404 permits that would be required for dredge and fill activities in those waters. However, states that have their own state wetland protection programs can still provide permitting coverage for waters of the state under their own regulations. So that's that, and I will turn it over now to, I think Tammy is next to talk about implementation.
Thanks, Jackie. And so I'm going to talk about implementation as it relates to highlighting the remote tools that are available, that we know are available. And then, of course, we're asking for feedback if there are any state or regional specific tools that would be helpful. So determining contribution of flow downstream. Now, we typically talk about boots on the ground and getting out in the field and looking at resources. And really, it's going to be a combination of boots on the ground and looking at these remote tools to help us determine some of these new concepts in the new rule. So we're going to continue to use USGS maps, state and local maps, aerial photography, all of those remote sensing tools that we have been using, and we're looking for what else is available. So one example is the GIS mapping or flow path, where we would use the USGS stream stat to determine the point that we're asking if this is a water of the US and incorporating what that stream network looks like as an example. We can go on to the next slide, 62. So for determining perennial or intermittent flow, again, using the best available remote sensing tools, we utilize the National Hydrography data set a lot, recognizing that there are inconsistencies or there are areas where we may be able to rely on this data more than others. So we use it as a starting point, just like we would NWI, to hone in on those areas where we need to come in and take a look at where that perennial or intermittent or ephemeral flow regime break is. Of course, site visits are very important, but we want to do the majority of the work, the most work that we can on our computers using these remote tools before we get to the field. So another tool is stream flow duration assessment method, and those are typically developed regionally. So like I'm familiar with some of those tools in Appalachia where we tried to predict, again, where those flow regime breaking points were based on topography, slopes, vegetation, soils, and trying to predict where those flow regime changes are to help us when we get in the field. Maybe not having to walk 20,000 feet of stream, maybe only walking a couple thousand feet of stream. So those are out there, and other folks are determining where the need is to develop those on a regional basis. Determining surface flow and surface water connections in that typical year. Again, very important concept. What we don't want to be out in the field making a determination based on that specific day or year when we know that's not a typical year. So Paul mentioned the antecedent precipitation tool, which was developed and enhanced by the Corps for this specific purpose. And then that'll be released and be able to be used ideally by the public. So that collects the NOAA precip data for the rolling average of the past 30 years. So we will be able to know, are we in a very, very dry year? Are we trending in a wet year? And how can we correlate this data to what we're seeing in the field to make a good determination based on the facts in front of us? Go on to the next slide. So on 64, determining adjacency, again, looking at the best available resources. So we're looking to be able to use aerial photography and other remote tools to help us identify those natural berms or banks, or we talked about potentially dunes or a series of dunes, being able to identify those on mapping to help us determine, is that a natural break and the wetland would therefore be adjacent, or identifying those artificial structures and being able to tell if there's still a connection, a culvert or a tide gate that provides that hydrologic connection. So are we able to see those evidence of hydrologic connection on plannings, permitting data, any other information that we can collect and have a best case of what that situation is out there. And then the next slide, determining inundation by flooding. Again, what evidence is out there to help us determine if there's an exchange in hydrology. And so one tool is the Corps Hydrologic Engineering Center in Davis, California. They've developed the HEC-RAS, so a modeling software to predict or project when there's an inundation, how far that inundation would occur. And then, of course, site visits are very important to either verify or collect additional data and combine that with the remote information for the best decision that we can make. Aquatic resource mapping. So we mentioned that briefly. In developing this rule and in past rules, we get a lot of comments asking, why don't we just have a map of all waters of the U.S.? Wouldn't that be so much easier? Well, of course it would be, but we also realize the difficulties with that. There are other states or tribes or regional areas that have undertaken this role as trying to map their specific resources. Some have done a very, very good job and have an extensive data set. So we want to take what's out there, working with other agencies and other entities that are collecting this data, and get the best mapping we can. We've talked about potentially starting with TNWs. A lot of districts have those mapped to an extent. And when we make a determination for what a water is, or if a resource isn't a water, then we could have that data available. Of course, with all kinds of caveats. Just because a water doesn't show up on your particular site doesn't mean a determination has been made. So we want to be able to recognize that mapping could be helpful to an extent as long as we caveat. So there's an effort out there being led at the national level with EPA and Army in coordination with DOI to better identify, can we truly have this mapping system to help support decisions in the future? And then lastly, the NWAPR, the NUPR, whatever we want to call it, went into effect June 22nd. We talked about the antecedent precipitation tool, and then those regionally specific FSAMs that will be developed as needed and then released over time. And then lastly, I'll talk about some joint memoranda. So we talked about the duplication or overlap or potential confusion between USDA programs under the Food Security Act and under the Clean Water Act. So we have a memoranda that's actually finalized earlier last month with Army, Corps, USDA, NRCS, and EPA, basically spelling out the differences in our programs and then guiding each agency when we write our jurisdictional determination letters to recognize that there's another authority out there that could make a determination if indeed this area is in agricultural production. And then NRCS would include language that refers the applicant to the Corps of Engineers if there was a Clean Water Act mentioned. So I think that's all my slides. We're about out of time, and I think we're going to open it up to overall questions now.
Thank you again so much to Jackie and Tammy and Erica and Paul for presenting today and for taking the time to go through all of this.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, Audra. And thanks to everybody from the states and from the Corps who joined us. I think this was a really good training session. And like Tammy had mentioned, this is the first of several that we'll be doing, so more to come.